Hey everyone. Today I want to talk about the Constitution and more specifically the rights that it contains. There are two schools of thought when it comes to rights that I'm aware of. One being that rights come from government and or the Constitution itself, if we're talking about America, or rights are pre-constitutional, or many people refer to them as natural rights, whereas just by virtue of being a human, you have certain rights because you're human or because they are granted by a creator or a god. And there's an interesting point, interesting connection that I made recently about this that I'd like to explore a little bit. So, when it comes to natural rights, this is the point of view that a lot of Republicans and conservatives typically take, obviously because it's compatible with a religious worldview, specifically Christian worldview. So while the Republicans and the right typically espouse this belief, it's not necessarily followed through in their policies. Because if we think about it, if rights are given to us by God and or rights are just part of being human, and the Constitution only reasserts those rights without being able to override them, well, then the rights enumerated in the Constitution don't just apply to Americans because they're inborn in us. That means it doesn't matter where you're born, what language you speak, where you're currently located, your race, socioeconomic status, current citizenship. It doesn't matter. You're a human being, and if you're going by rights as pre-constitutional, well, then they apply to everyone equally, not just Americans. So if we look at the Bill of Rights real quick, just for a starting base to go on. So free speech and expression of religion, the right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. You can't be detained without being indicted by a grand jury. You are entitled to a trial by jury, and you are protected from cruel and unusual punishments. So this is something I've been thinking about for a couple days, so I haven't fully explored this idea yet, but there are two main parts of U.S. foreign policy that I think would apply if politicians who say they believe in natural rights actually followed that to its conclusion. The first being immigration. Immigration, or at least controls on immigration, in and of itself is an admission that we are not all equal, that there is a difference between Americans and Germans, Americans and Canadians, and so forth. But if the rights enumerated in the Constitution apply to everyone, that sort of breaks down the distinction between citizens and non-citizens. Therefore, you would think, with a natural rights point of view, that people should be able to leave and immigrate to the United States pretty freely. But of course, that is not how things are going today. If you've seen the presidential election, Donald Trump and Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and everybody else talk a pretty, it's almost very nationalistic. It's they have pretty strong rhetoric against immigration. And some of them have even talking about forcefully removing immigrants that are already here. But if they do espouse natural rights or a pre-constitutional interpretation of where rights come from, well, then they cannot divvy up people into different groups and say you have a right to be in the United States and you do not have a right. It's a very strange division if they hold both policy, like both ideas at the same time. If we think about it, just in the past 100 years or so, well, even I guess from the founding of the country, immigration was very loose, very open. I mean, Ellis Island was very active. I don't know the dates, but very active. And from what I understand, the controls were very loose. All they did was just record the names, and I think they took pictures of people that came over, and they just passed them through letting them in. All they wanted to do was record who was coming in. And so this very strict immigration policy and stances that we see nowadays seem to be relatively new. If we look to the past, for an example, immigration policies are very loose, and I would say very consistent with the idea that rights are pre-constitutional. The second way that I think policy would have to change, or at least be debated more, is the war on terror, and specifically drone strikes. Even if we assume that whatever process that the president uses for his kill list, or whatever secret courts they use to give the go-ahead for shooting Hellfire missiles at houses and terrorists to try to get them, more non-combatants have been killed in drone strikes than actual terrorists. And it's a very significant problem. I've even heard accounts from children and people in these countries that drone strikes occur in, where they're afraid of the sky. And they're afraid whenever they hear a drone overhead, and for good reason. But if we look at the Bill of Rights as far as having a trial by jury, no cruel and unusual punishments, there's a lot of people overseas that are dying without due process. Just think about, we don't do this in the United States. If we think that there's a drug dealer or a murderer in a house, even if there's a warrant and there's evidence, we don't shoot missiles into houses to get these people. And we don't accept collateral damage in raids to get criminals over here. And so if rights are universal or pre-constitutional and they're embedded in everyone, well then the standards for here should be the same for over there. That's the main idea I want to put out there. It's a very interesting paradigm to take to its full conclusion. And if you pressed some of these politicians, or even just people on the street who think about rights and they're crazy enough to indulge in this type of thinking, if you support controls on immigration and you support drone strikes in other countries, well then you have to admit that you do not believe that rights are natural and that they are pre-constitutional. You have to admit that they are granted by governments. You have to admit that they are granted by pieces of paper with words written on them. This happens both on the left and the right, but I think this is something that politicians and thinkers and policymakers really need to come to grips with. It's a wide divide between rhetoric of saying that all people have embedded rights from their creator, but then not grant those rights and protections to people outside of the U.S. or that don't have a social security number. So the line between natural rights is whether or not you have a social security number, which is kind of silly. And I would say it's caused a lot of pain and suffering in the world. All right, well, thanks for listening. I'll talk to you later.